Velistra moved through the corridors like a shadow given form. The metal walls of the human outpost meant nothing to her, their solid structure incapable of impeding her passage. She did not walk so much as glide, her form shifting seamlessly through obstacles, untouched and untouchable. The Zyphorians had long considered themselves above the crude physicality of lesser beings, and Velistra embodied that supremacy. She was a specter, a blade in the dark, and tonight, her target was a human. The mission was beneath her, but orders were orders. Ethan Voss, a human revolutionary, had been stirring unrest across the galactic territories, rallying species against the Zyphorian dominion. He was insignificant, a primitive creature who had somehow managed to inconvenience the Council enough that they had sent her to erase him. A waste of her abilities. Humans were slow, predictable. Their world was one of barriers, locked doors, reinforced walls, crude defenses against those who needed them. But Velistra had never needed defenses. Her arrival was undetected. She phased through sentries as though they were no more than air, their dull human eyes scanning for threats of a different kind. She moved between dimensions in flickers of light, a being both there and not there, untethered from the clumsy laws that governed lesser organisms. The arrogance of humanity amused her. Their rebellion was laughable, their defiance like children resisting the inevitable hand of authority. Ethan Voss would be no different. She slipped into his quarters with practiced ease, materializing just inside the threshold. The room was dimly lit, the artificial glow of a data console casting faint blue reflections against the steel walls. A man sat at the desk, his back to her, broad-shouldered and still. He did not turn. He did not acknowledge her arrival. Strange. Even the dullest creatures possess some sense of unease in the presence of a predator. But Ethan Voss simply continued staring at the screen, his fingers unmoving over the console. Velistra allowed herself a moment of amusement. Perhaps he was unaware of what was coming. Perhaps he thought himself safe, surrounded by the feeble protections his species relied upon. She reached for him, her hand passing effortlessly through the chair, reaching for the fragile flesh of his throat. The moment she touched him, he would be gone. He would cease, reduced to nothing, wiped clean from existence like all the others before him. But before her fingers could close, something happened that should not have been possible. A force surged through her, like a static charge ripping through every cell of her being. She gasped, actually gasped, as something foreign locked her in place, something solid, something real. The sensation was wrong, alien, something she had never encountered in all her years of effortless domination. Before she could react, before she could phase, Ethan moved. Faster than he should have. Faster than a human should be capable of. His hand shot out, gripping her wrist. Gripping her. It was the first time in her existence that someone had ever touched her, the first time she had ever felt something pressing against her skin. Panic surged through her, white-hot and blinding. Her instincts screamed for her to phase, to disappear, to slip through reality itself, but she couldn't. The force holding her, whatever it was, locked her in this plane, forcing her to remain tangible. She struggled, her body twisting, but Ethan turned with her, using her own momentum to pivot. In an instant, she found herself slammed back against the cold steel of the wall. The impact rattled through her, sending a shock through nerves she had never paid attention to before.
Pain.
A dull ache in her back, unfamiliar and unwelcome. She stared up at him, stunned, disoriented, her mind scrambling to process the impossible. Ethan Voss met her gaze with calm intensity, his grip unwavering, his face unreadable. There was no panic, no fear, only certainty. His presence filled the space, no longer the fragile prey she had envisioned, but something else entirely. "You're not untouchable," he said, his voice steady, a quiet certainty behind the words. Velistra couldn't respond. For the first time in her life, she didn't know how. A shudder passed through Velistra's body, an involuntary tremor that betrayed the depth of her shock. Her mind screamed at her to phase, to retreat, to become what she had always been, untouchable, ethereal, beyond reach. But the force binding her to this reality held firm, an unseen energy coursing through her limbs like chains forged from pure defiance. It was impossible. It was wrong. Ethan Voss studied her, his gaze steady, neither cruel nor triumphant. His fingers remained locked around her wrist, their pressure an unfamiliar weight, an anchor pinning her to a reality she had never been forced to endure. He wasn't afraid of her. That alone sent a sharp fissure through the foundation of her understanding. "How?" she breathed. Her voice was quieter than she intended, raw and uneven. Ethan tilted his head slightly, as if considering whether she was worth answering. "You think you're the first Zyphorian to try?" The words struck harder than they should have. Zyphorians had always been invincible, their ability to phase through matter a natural law as absolute as the movement of stars. That a human could dismiss her kind so casually made her chest tighten with something dangerously close to unease. She willed herself to remain still, to mask the riot of emotions clawing at her composure. "You knew I was coming," she said, forcing her voice into something cool, controlled. Ethan gave the barest hint of a smirk. "Of course I did." Velistra had no breath for arrogance. The fact remained. He had prepared for her. No one prepared for a Zyphorian assassin. No one needed to. Their targets never saw them coming, never had time to resist. Yet here she was, trapped, unable to shift, unable to escape. She shifted her weight, testing his grip, but his hold was unyielding. The pressure against her back kept her pinned, the steel wall cold against her skin, its sensation uncomfortably real. She had never felt confined before. The Zyphorian body was never meant to experience such limitations. "What is this?" she demanded, her voice sharper now, edged with the frustration of someone unaccustomed to asking questions. Ethan's smirk faded. "It's a disruptor field," he said simply. "A frequency tuned to Zyphorian physiology. Your molecules are locked in phase. No shifting, no slipping between dimensions. Just you. Here. With me." The weight of his words settled over her like a vice. Locked in phase. Her greatest strength, the very thing that made her species superior, had been stripped from her with the press of a button. She had never felt so vulnerable. She gritted her teeth, forcing herself to think. Panic was a human failing, not hers. This was just another challenge, another test of strategy. "And what now?" she asked. "Do you kill me?" Ethan's expression didn't change. "Should I?" The question hung between them, heavier than the silence that followed. Velistra knew how this was supposed to go. She was the predator, and he was the target. That was how it had always been. And yet, Ethan was studying her, but not like prey. Not like something to be crushed underfoot. His grip remained firm, his stance steady, but there was no malice in his eyes. No fear, either. Velistra had never met a human like this. She exhaled slowly, leveling her gaze with his. "You don't know what you're doing," she said, quieter now. "If you let me go, I will complete my mission." Something flickered in his expression. Amusement? Pity? He leaned in just slightly, his voice lowering. "You sure about that?" The certainty in his tone sent another ripple of unease through her. There was something dangerous about his confidence. Humans weren't supposed to have that, not against her. But Ethan Voss wasn't afraid, and worse, he knew something she didn't. That made him the greater threat. Velistra swallowed her pride. "If I'm locked in phase, I can't fight," she said evenly. "But if I'm not a threat, then what am I?" For the first time, Ethan's grip loosened. Just a fraction. Just enough to make her wonder if he truly intended to keep her here. He held her gaze for a moment longer, and then, finally, he released her. Velistra didn't move. Not because she couldn't. The disruptor field still hummed softly, keeping her locked in this reality, but because she didn't know what came next. That alone terrified her more than anything else. Velistra remained still, the absence of Ethan's grip somehow more unsettling than its presence. The wall behind her was no longer a prison, yet she felt just as confined, trapped not by force, but by uncertainty. The disruptor field still held her in phase, denying her the escape she had always taken for granted. But it wasn't just the technology restraining her now, it was something else, something far more dangerous. She was hesitating. Ethan stepped back, watching her with the quiet patience of someone who had already won. There was no mockery in his expression, no need for gloating. He didn't see her as a defeated enemy or a conquered adversary. He simply waited, as if he already knew what she would do next, as if the choice had never really been his to make. A slow, measured breath filled her lungs. It was unnatural to breathe this deeply, to feel the rhythm of her own body so acutely. Zyphorians were never meant to be this present in their own flesh. Their existence was fluid, effortless, unbound by the constraints of touch and form. And yet, in this moment, Velistra was nothing but solid. The realization made her pulse quicken. She had spent a lifetime believing in the inevitability of her people's power, the certainty of their rule. Zyphorians had always been untouchable, not just in body, but in purpose. Their dominance was a fact of the universe, an order as natural as the movement of planets. To question it was to deny the very structure of existence. But here she was, trapped, helpless, and, for the first time, uncertain. Ethan had done what no one else ever had. He had forced her to feel. "You're quiet," he observed. "Not what I expected." Velistra's gaze snapped to his, the sharpness in her eyes returning. "You expected me to beg?" "No," he shook his head slightly. "I expected you to lie to yourself." The words stung in a way she wasn't prepared for. Zyphorians didn't entertain self-doubt. They didn't need to. But now, standing here, stripped of everything that had once made her invincible, she wasn't sure what to believe anymore. Ethan crossed his arms, his stance casual but unreadable. "You've spent your whole life knowing you couldn't be touched. That changes a person. Makes them reckless. Makes them blind." His eyes flicked to hers, searching. "But you're not blind anymore, are you?" She wanted to argue. She wanted to sneer, to dismiss his words as human arrogance. But she couldn't, because he was right. Her throat tightened. "If you think this changes anything, you're wrong." Ethan's lips quirked, not quite a smile. "Am I?" Silence stretched between them, thick with something Velistra didn't have a name for. The certainty she had once wrapped around herself like armor was gone, leaving her raw and exposed. There was no denying what had happened here, no erasing the moment she had felt the weight of another's touch for the first time in her existence. A lesser creature would have crumbled under that revelation. Velistra was not lesser. She pushed away from the wall, forcing her body to move despite the disquiet in her mind. The disruptor field still clung to her, humming faintly against her skin, but she ignored it. She stood tall, leveling Ethan with a look that dared him to believe she was anything less than what she had always been. "I could still kill you," she said, though the words lacked the venom they once would have carried. Ethan nodded, as if acknowledging a simple truth. "You could try." For the first time, Velistra wasn't sure if she would. She turned toward the door, the weight of the conversation settling deep within her bones. This wasn't a defeat. It wasn't a surrender. But it was something else, something unfamiliar. A fracture in her perfect, untouchable existence. She didn't know where it would lead, but she would find out. The corridor stretched before her, dimly lit and lined with the cold, unfeeling steel of human engineering. Each step Velistra took felt heavier than the last, the weight of something unfamiliar settling into her bones. The disruptor field had done its job, locking her in phase, making her feel present in a way she never had before. But even now, as she moved forward, there was something deeper at play. Ethan hadn't stopped her. He had let her walk away. No one let a Zyphorian assassin walk away. She told herself it was a trick, a manipulation meant to disarm her, to make her question herself. Humans were cunning when they had to be, adapting to survive in ways that defied logic. But she wasn't so easily swayed. She had a mission, a purpose. She had been shaped by something greater than one moment of doubt. And yet, the echo of his words followed her. "I expected you to lie to yourself." The thought made her fists clench. Ethan Voss had done what no human should have been capable of. He had seen her. Not just her form, not just her ability, but her. Zyphorians did not entertain self-reflection. They did not need to justify their existence. They were superior. Beyond question. Beyond touch. But she had been touched. Her fingers still tingled where his grip had held her, an echo of the impossible. She could still feel the cold press of the wall at her back, the sharp breath that had left her lungs when she had realized, truly realized, that she had been made vulnerable, that a human had done this to her. Her steps slowed. Ahead, the exit loomed, the path to freedom open. Beyond it, the dark expanse of space, the certainty of home, of control. If she left now, she could reclaim her purpose. She could report back to the council, tell them of the human's defenses, his strategies, his weaknesses. She could finish what she was sent to do. But the thought rang hollow. Velistra had always believed her existence to be unshakable, her path unquestionable. But something had changed in that small, dimly lit room. A fracture, a hairline crack in the foundation of what she had always known. She had never doubted before.
Now she did.
A breath caught in her throat, frustration curling in her chest like a storm refusing to break. This was not how it was supposed to go. She had not been trained for this. Doubt was weakness. And yet, standing here, on the edge of escape, she hesitated. She hesitated. The realization sent something cold through her veins. A shift in the air behind her made her freeze. She didn't need to turn to know who it was. "You're still here," Ethan's voice came, calm and unreadable. She exhaled slowly. "You should have stopped me. I figured you'd stop yourself." His certainty unsettled her more than any physical restraint ever could. She turned, finding him standing just beyond the threshold of the corridor, hands at his sides, posture relaxed. There was no smugness in his expression, no sense of victory. He had let her leave, knowing she might not.
And he had been right.
She studied him in silence, searching for something, anything that would restore the balance of power between them. But she found no fear in his stance, no anticipation of violence. He didn't see her as a threat anymore. And that was what truly unnerved her. Because neither did she. Her fingers twitched at her sides, an instinctive response, but she didn't reach for a weapon. She didn't lunge. The kill should have been easy. A flicker of movement, a well-placed strike. And yet, for the first time in her existence, she wasn't sure if she wanted to. She took a slow step forward, closing the distance between them, her voice quiet but steady. "You think this changes everything?" Ethan met her gaze without flinching. "Doesn't it?" The silence between them was charged, thick with something she couldn't name. She had come here to erase him. Now, she wasn't sure who she was without that mission. Her fingers curled into a fist, then slowly loosened. The walls of the corridor felt closer than they had before, the weight of her own thoughts pressing in. She had never once asked herself what came next. Until now. Velistra had always understood the concept of inevitability, the certainty of action, the unfaltering march of purpose. Zyphorians did not waver. They did not falter. And yet, as she stood before Ethan Voss, the space between them charged with unspoken understanding, she realized that certainty had abandoned her. She had never been uncertain before. The mission should have been everything. It had been everything. She had followed the coordinates, infiltrated the station, moved unseen through its corridors like a shadow of inevitability. He should have been dead before he ever knew she was there. But he had known. He had expected her. And now, after everything, he was still breathing. Ethan watched her with that same unreadable expression, his posture relaxed, but not careless. He wasn't afraid of her, not anymore. He had unraveled the myth of her untouchability, stripped away the armor of certainty she had always worn without question. She should have hated him for it. Instead, she found herself standing here unmoored. "You're thinking too much," Ethan said, tilting his head slightly. "You don't like it, do you?" Velistra's jaw tightened. "Zyphorians do not think too much." He huffed a quiet laugh. "Then you must be something else." "Something else?" The words settled deep, an anchor in unfamiliar waters. She had never considered the possibility of being other than what she was. Zyphorians did not change. They were absolute, unshakable, unquestioning. But she had questioned, and now she couldn't stop. She shifted her weight, testing the sensation of her own presence in this space, in this moment. Even now, the disruptor field held her in phase, keeping her bound to this reality. But the real restraint was no longer the technology, it was the choice before her. "What do you expect me to do?" she asked, voice quieter now. Ethan's expression didn't change. "I don't expect anything." That, more than anything, made her uneasy. Expectations gave shape to actions, provided direction. Without them, there was only possibility, unruly, untamed. She had never lived in a world of possibilities before. Her gaze flickered past him, toward the corridor that led back to the heart of the station, the way she had come. The exit remained open, the promise of escape unspoken but ever-present. She could still leave, still return to her people, still complete what she had been sent here to do. And yet, her feet did not move. For the first time in her existence, the path forward was not a matter of inevitability, but choice. The realization sent something cold through her chest. She was not supposed to choose. Her entire life had been dictated by purpose, by the unquestionable truth of Zyphorian supremacy. To stray from that path was to abandon everything she was. And yet, standing here, feeling in a way she had never felt before, she couldn't ignore the truth pressing down on her like a force of gravity. Something had already shifted. The question was whether she would fight it or follow it. Ethan exhaled, his voice softer now. "You don't have to decide anything right now." But she did. Because every second she stood here, every breath she took in this moment of hesitation, she was already making a decision. And she didn't know if she could ever go back. Velistra had always understood the simplicity of action. Thought was a luxury, hesitation a weakness. The Zyphorian way was swift, decisive. To question was to invite failure, and failure was not tolerated. She had never needed to think beyond the mission, never allowed herself the indulgence of doubt. And yet, she was still standing here. Ethan had not moved, had not pressed her for answers she did not yet have. He simply waited, as if knowing she was waging a war within herself, a battle she had never expected to fight. His patience unsettled her. He should have been afraid, should have been desperate to act. Instead, he watched her as though she were the uncertain variable. The weight of that realization settled deep in her chest. She had been trained to see humans as lesser, limited creatures shackled by their own fragile existence. Their dependency on physicality made them weak, predictable. But Ethan had touched her, gripped her, held her in place like she was no different from him. And she had felt it. The Zyphorian Council would never believe it. If she returned now, if she confessed that a human had made her tangible, they would see it as a flaw, a malfunction in her form. She would be studied, dissected, discarded if necessary. They could not allow an untouchable to be touched. The thought struck her harder than she expected. She had always belonged to the Zyphorian collective, her existence a thread in a larger weave. But now, for the first time, she felt the possibility of being severed from that certainty. What was she without them? Ethan shifted slightly, his voice pulling her back. "You're not the first to question things, you know." She frowned. "And what happened to the others?" His expression was unreadable. Some ran back to what was familiar. Some decided they didn't like what they found in themselves. And some, he exhaled slowly. Some realized they had a choice.
Choice.
The word felt foreign on her tongue. Zyphorians did not choose. Their existence was determined by something greater, by purpose woven into them from the moment they came into being. The idea of choice was chaotic, dangerous. And yet, standing here, she could no longer pretend that she had not already stepped into its gravity. She could kill Ethan now. It would be easy. A flicker of movement, a calculated strike. She had eliminated targets in far less favorable positions. The path to completing her mission was still open. But so was another. Her fingers twitched, then stilled. The decision had already been made, long before she allowed herself to acknowledge it. Without another word, she turned away from the exit. Not toward home, but toward the unknown. Velistra moved without speaking, her steps deliberate, though not entirely certain. Ethan didn't stop her. He only watched, his expression betraying neither triumph nor relief. It was as if he understood the weight of this moment better than she did. The air in the corridor felt heavier now, charged with the unspoken. Each step away from the exit pressed against her like gravity, pulling her deeper into something she had never allowed herself to consider.
Choice.
The word still felt dangerous.
Wrong.
And yet, she had made one. Her mind tried to justify it, to reshape the act into something tactical. Perhaps staying would give her more information. Perhaps it was the best way to ensure the success of her mission in the long run. But she knew those were lies. She wasn't thinking like a Xiphorian anymore. Ethan fell into step beside her, his presence an anchor she wasn't sure she wanted. He did not ask questions, did not demand explanations. He simply walked, as if it were the most natural thing in the universe that an assassin who had come to kill him was now choosing to stay. She should have despised his calm. Instead, she envied it. The corridor opened into a control chamber, dimly lit by the glow of human technology. Screens flickered with tactical data, surveillance feeds, system readouts. It was a room designed for command for war. Velistra had always believed humans were reckless in their conflicts, ruled by emotion rather than strategy. But as she looked at the carefully organized data, at the precision of their preparations, she realized she had underestimated them. Just as she had underestimated him. Ethan moved to a console, pressing a few commands with ease. A schematic of the station unfolded in glowing blue light. This place was never meant to be a battleground, he said, his voice measured. But that's what it's become. Velistra studied the map. It was a fortress disguised as a research station. The layers of security, the redundancies in power systems, it was all designed for resilience, for endurance. They know we are coming. She had always believed Xiphorians were inevitable, unstoppable. But now, staring at this, she saw the truth. The humans weren't just waiting to be conquered. They were preparing to fight. Ethan turned to her, and for the first time, she saw something beneath his calm. Not fear, not anger, resolve. You don't have to tell me why you're still here, he said. But if you're staying, I need to know one thing. She met his gaze.
What?
His expression was unreadable. Are you going to help us? The question settled over her like a storm, unraveling everything she had ever known. She did not answer. Not yet. But she did not walk away either. Velistra did not answer immediately. The weight of Ethan's question settled into the space between them, heavy and unyielding. The idea of helping the humans felt foreign, unnatural. Her entire existence had been shaped around the certainty of Xiphorian superiority, the inevitability of their conquest. To turn against that truth was unthinkable. And yet, she had already begun to. She studied the holographic display, the intricate defense systems the humans had constructed in anticipation of an attack. It was impressive, more so than she had expected. They were not simply waiting to be overrun. They were preparing to resist. Preparing to survive. Something in that realization unsettled her. Xiphorians did not prepare for survival. They assumed it. Ethan remained still, waiting, but not pressing. He understood something fundamental about her predicament, perhaps more than she did. He knew she was standing on the edge of something vast, something she had never allowed herself to consider. If you're still trying to convince yourself you have a choice, you do, he said finally. You wouldn't be standing here otherwise. Velistra's gaze snapped to him. You assume too much. He met her stare, unflinching.
Do I?
She wanted to tell him that he was wrong, that she had not made a choice, that she was merely gathering information, waiting for the right opportunity to complete her mission. But the words felt hollow even before they reached her tongue. She exhaled slowly, turning back to the display. The human defenses were strong, but they had weaknesses, flaws that the Xiphorian assault would exploit. She saw the points of failure, the vulnerabilities hidden in the architecture of the station. She could still warn her people, still ensure their victory. But for the first time, she questioned whether victory was what she wanted. Ethan shifted slightly, his voice quieter now. I don't expect you to change who you are overnight. Her fingers twitched at her sides. You assume I will change. I assume you already have. The word struck deeper than she wanted to admit. She had always believed herself untouchable, immune to doubt, to fear, to choice. But Ethan was right. She had already made a choice when she had stepped away from the exit, when she had turned back toward the unknown instead of retreating to the certainty of home. She had changed. The question now was what she would do with it. Her voice, when she finally spoke, was steady. If I help you, if I betray my people, there is no going back. Ethan's expression remained unreadable. I know. The silence stretched between them, a final barrier between past and future. Then, slowly, Velistra reached forward and deactivated the weakest link in the human defenses. Her choice had been made. Velistra's fingers lingered over the console as the final command executed. The weak link in the human defenses had been deactivated, not as an act of sabotage, but as something else. Something she couldn't yet define. She had expected the weight of betrayal to crush her, to suffocate her under the magnitude of what she had done. But it didn't. It felt like breathing. Ethan didn't react immediately. He only watched, his expression unreadable. Perhaps he understood the significance of this moment. Perhaps he was waiting for her to realize it herself. She had not simply helped the humans. She had chosen them. Velistra straightened, her posture rigid despite the storm inside her. Your defenses are inefficient. Your people will not survive unless you adapt. Ethan's mouth twitched in something almost like amusement. And here I thought you were just betraying your own kind. She stiffened. The word betrayal felt sharp, cutting into something raw inside her. Zyphorians did not betray. They did not hesitate, did not question. And yet she had done both. She forced herself to focus. The Zyphorian fleet will not attack head-on. They will find the weakest point, dismantle your systems from within. You cannot rely on static defenses alone. Ethan crossed his arms, nodding slightly. Then what do you suggest? The simplicity of the question startled her. He was asking her opinion, treating her as an ally rather than an enemy. The concept was disorienting. She glanced at the console, recalculating. You need to turn your weaknesses into traps. Make them think they've found a way in, then collapse the passage behind them. Cut off their advantages before they can use them. Ethan nodded, considering her words. And what about their disruptor tech? They're expecting to phase through our defenses. Velistra hesitated, an old instinct warring against new understanding. If she answered this, there would be no going back. She exhaled, steadying herself. You need an electromagnetic dampening field. It will force them to remain tangible, vulnerable. Ethan's gaze held hers, unreadable. Then he turned to the console, inputting commands without hesitation. He wasn't questioning her, wasn't second-guessing whether she was sincere. He trusted her. The realization sent a shiver through her. She had never been trusted before. Ethan finished adjusting the system, then met her gaze once more. They'll come soon. Velistra nodded. I know. This time, she did not waver.